Autumn, 1939. The chill of the North Sea swept through the open-air testing range at Hillersleben, where the German army's most brilliant and most dangerous minds had gathered to watch an experiment that should not have been possible. Beneath the gray sky stood a weapon unlike any the Reich had ever built. Long, skeletal, gleaming with frost, its barrel stretching nearly 100 meters across the clearing. It looked less like a cannon and more like a factory pipe left by giants. Colonel Walter Dornberger of the Army Ordnance Office adjusted his greatcoat and studied the men before him. They were not soldiers, but engineers, mathematicians, metallurgists, the new breed of warriors. Beside him, a gaunt, intense man named August Coenders spoke in a voice that trembled between genius and madness. "Gentlemen," he said, gesturing toward the monstrous barrel, "you are about to witness the first step toward a weapon that will make distance irrelevant. London itself will one day tremble from here." At the far end of the range, a small crew loaded the projectile, a 140mm steel dart. It was not powered by gunpowder alone. The shell was designed to be accelerated by a series of secondary charges placed along the barrel's length. Each charge would ignite in sequence as the projectile passed, multiplying its velocity with every meter. Coenders called it Hochdruckpumpe, the high-pressure pump. When the signal came, there was no conventional explosion. Instead, a strange, layered roar echoed through the forest, a deep mechanical heartbeat followed by a thunderclap that shattered the air. The shell disappeared into the clouds. Seconds later, a distant thud reached them from miles away. Dornberger checked his stopwatch. 10 kilometers, he said. Not bad. Coenders smiled thinly. Next time, 20. It was a beginning. Inside the Reich's labyrinthine weapons bureaucracy, Coenders' idea took root like a fever dream. Hitler himself was obsessed with Vergeltungswaffen, vengeance weapons that could strike Britain without risking his bombers. He had already approved rocket programs under Werner von Braun and long-range flying bombs designed by Fiesler and Argus. But the V3, as it would later be called, promised something even more audacious. A gun that could fire across the English Channel from hidden bunkers in France. No rocket fuel, no pilots, no guidance systems. Just mathematics, pressure, and steel. The first theoretical calculations arrived at Peenemünde in early 1940. To reach London from northern France, a distance of over 160 kilometers, a shell would need to exit the barrel at 1,500 meters per second. At that velocity, air friction alone would melt ordinary steel. The barrel itself would have to be reinforced, the charges synchronized to within thousandths of a second. The weapon would need to be buried underground, protected by concrete thick enough to withstand direct bombing. When presented to Albert Speer, Hitler's new Minister of Armaments, the concept was met with both fascination and unease. "It is magnificent," Speer admitted, "and completely insane." But the Führer's imagination had been captured. "England thinks itself safe behind the Channel," Hitler said during one of his private conferences. "We will show them that no distance protects them. Their cities will burn from a gun they cannot see." Orders followed swiftly. In 1942, Coenders and his chief collaborator, engineer Heinz Smalenbach, were placed under SS supervision and given unlimited access to materials and labor. The project received the code name Wies, Meadow. Few knew what it meant, few were asked. At night, in the candlelit drafting rooms of Kassel and Dessau, the engineers worked in silence. They knew the mathematics was possible, but the physics was merciless. Each test barrel failed. Some exploded, shredding the range with metal shards that tore through the walls of observation bunkers. Yet every failure only deepened the Reich's obsession. By 1943, British cities lay in ruins from conventional bombing. The Luftwaffe was losing its edge, and the dream of the V weapons grew ever more desperate. When the first reports of the new weapon reached Allied intelligence, the British dismissed them as exaggerations. "A gun that fires 100 miles? One analyst scoffed. "Pure fantasy." But fantasy was the Reich's most dangerous weapon. That winter, Coenders received his final orders: full-scale construction of the first operational battery in northern France. Site selection fell to SS engineers under General Hans Kammler, the same man overseeing the V2 rocket program. They chose a limestone plateau near the village of Mimoyekes, within range of London. The design called for 5 parallel barrels, each 130 meters long, buried in concrete tunnels angled toward England. When complete, each gun would be capable of firing 1 shell every 5 seconds, a mechanical bombardment that, in theory, could send 300 shells an hour across the Channel. No soldier in history had imagined such range. No empire had ever possessed such reach. As snow fell over Germany in the last days of 1939, Coenders walked alone through his laboratory, staring at the blueprints pinned to the wall. The equations were beautiful, flawless, merciless. The weapon, if completed, would redefine the boundaries of war. But he could not ignore the whisper of doubt that haunted every engineer who had ever served the Reich. Somewhere, deep in the back of his mind, he wondered what would happen if his invention actually worked, if the gun truly could erase cities from a distance, with no warning, no defense. He closed his notebook and turned off the lamp. Outside, the night was silent, except for the faint rumble of distant artillery. The world was already burning, and he was building the match that would set it aflame. Spring 1943, northern France. Along the windswept chalk hills near the small village of Mimoyekis, the earth trembled with the rhythm of machines. Diesel engines roared inside tunnels cut deep into the white limestone. The air stank of cordite and damp rock. Above ground, the fields still carried the scars of the last war. Shell craters now filled with wildflowers, trenches hidden beneath grass. To the villagers, it seemed as though the ghosts of Verdun had returned, but this time they wore black SS uniforms and spoke of a new weapon that would end England forever. The orders had come directly from the Reich Chancellery, a massive underground fortress to house Adolf Hitler's newest superweapon, the V3 cannon. The construction code name was Bauvorhaben 711, but the engineers called it simply Die Festung, the fortress. It would be the largest gun installation ever conceived, a complex of concrete galleries and shafts stretching half a kilometer through solid rock. The man in charge was SS General Hans Kammler, a bureaucrat of annihilation whose genius for organization rivaled his ruthlessness. Kammler had overseen the building of V2 launch sites and the underground rocket factory at Mittelwerk, where thousands of slave laborers died producing Germany's miracle weapons. Mimoyekes would follow the same pattern. By April, convoys of trucks rolled in daily, carrying cement, steel, and explosives. Prisoners from Buchenwald and forced laborers from Poland and Ukraine dug the tunnels by hand under the whips of German overseers. The noise of drills and jackhammers echoed through the valleys night and day. Every few days, new coffins were carried out under tarps, men crushed by rockfalls, suffocated by dust, or executed for exhaustion. In one of the upper galleries, engineer August Coenders walked among the blueprints pinned to the tunnel walls. His boots were covered in chalk dust. He had aged rapidly, his once dark hair streaked with gray, his uniform perpetually damp. Yet his mind burned with obsession. "The angle must be 50 degrees, he muttered to his assistant, Heinz Smallenbach, "and each barrel exactly 130 meters. Even one deviation will ruin the trajectory." Smallenbach nodded, scribbling calculations onto a notebook already spattered with mud. "And the charges? We'll need at least 40 per barrel for full velocity." Coenders frowned. "If we fire 40, the barrel melts. If we fire fewer, London lives." Their voices mingled with the rhythmic thud of hammers below. Outside, a camouflage net concealed the sprawling site from Allied reconnaissance aircraft. From above, Mimoyekes appeared as a series of innocuous farm buildings and quarries. Beneath, an empire of concrete was taking shape. A labyrinth of tunnels wide enough to drive trucks through, galleries carved for ammunition storage, and 5 main firing chambers aimed toward the southeast coast of England, just 165 kilometers away. The logistics were staggering. Each gun required thousands of tons of reinforced steel tubing and a hydraulic system capable of absorbing forces that would tear an ordinary cannon apart. The shells themselves were special, 2-meter-long projectiles fitted with tail fins and a delayed action fuse. They were called Sprenggranit 1000 and were meant to deliver a 140-kilogram explosive charge at supersonic speed. When completed, the installation would fire a continuous barrage across the channel, an unending rain of shells on London. The calculations predicted one strike every 12 seconds. Coenders' diagrams labeled the British capital as a black dot, with concentric circles expanding outward like ripples in water. He did not draw the people who lived inside those circles. Yet even among the engineers, doubt grew. The underground humidity corroded the steel barrels, and synchronization of the secondary charges proved nearly impossible. Every misfire threatened to destroy the gun itself. During early prototype tests at Misdroy on the Baltic coast, 2 barrels had burst, killing half the firing crew. The weapon worked in theory, but reality refused to obey. Still, the SS demanded progress. Kammler visited Mimoyeke in May, his black uniform spotless despite the mud and dust. He spoke little but carried a stopwatch and a pistol. He reminded the engineers that the Führer expects results, not excuses. After his visit, discipline hardened. Prisoners who faltered were shot on the spot. Engineers who complained were transferred to the front. By midsummer, the fortress had consumed more than 55,000 cubic meters of concrete. Electricity hummed through the tunnels. The first full-length barrels were lowered into position, massive metal snakes disappearing into the chalk. The installation resembled a buried battleship, with its guns pointing eternally toward London. On June 20th, 1943, the first test shot was fired from an incomplete chamber, using half the planned propellant. The roar shook the countryside. Windows shattered in nearby towns. The projectile reached a record range of 43 kilometers before plunging into the sea. Kammler declared the test a preliminary success and ordered full operational readiness by spring 1944. But the Allies were already watching. High-altitude reconnaissance flights by the Royal Air Force's Photo Reconnaissance Unit had begun spotting strange patterns near the Pas de Calais, roads leading to nowhere, heavy machinery disappearing into hillsides, rail lines ending abruptly in chalk mounds. Analysts at RAF Medmenham compared the images to intelligence reports from the French resistance. The conclusion was chilling. Germany was building something immense beneath the cliffs, something aimed directly at England. Back at Mimoyekes, Coenders read the latest technical report by lamplight. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling. The numbers mocked him. "The equations are perfect," he whispered, "but the world is not." He knew the gun might never work as designed, yet he also knew that failure meant death. For him, for Smalenbach, for everyone associated with the project. Outside, thunder rolled across the channel. The rain fell in heavy sheets, soaking the camouflage netting, turning the ground to white mud. The sea beyond was invisible, but Coenders imagined its cold expanse, and beyond that, the glittering lights of London. He wondered if the English engineers across the water were awake that night, listening to the same storm, unaware that beneath the French hillside, men were carving the weapon meant to erase them. He turned off the lamp. The tunnel lights flickered, and for a brief second, the chalk walls seemed to glow, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Winter, 1943. Deep beneath the chalk hills of Mimoyeke, the tunnels no longer echoed with drills, but with the nervous hum of power generators. The fortress had become a living organism, its arteries lined with cables, its lungs filled with the hiss of compressed air. But its heart, the colossal V3 cannon, refused to beat as the Reich demanded. August Coenders stood before the command chamber's main diagram, 5 parallel barrels drawn in red, all aimed at a point labeled simply London. Around him, his engineers argued over equations scrawled across blackboards. The numbers refused to align. The timing sequence for the 40 secondary charges, designed to ignite in perfect progression as the projectile accelerated, was off by milliseconds. To the Reich, that was invisible. To physics, it was fatal. "Again," Coenders said. His voice was low, but the men obeyed immediately. In the firing gallery, a small-scale model, barely 10 meters long, was prepared for testing. When the signal light flashed green, the technicians ducked behind the concrete bulkhead. The explosion came a heartbeat later, not a clean crack, but a shriek, a sound like tearing metal, followed by a rush of air and dust. When the smoke cleared, the model barrel lay split open like a ruptured pipe. 2 workers were dead, another screaming, his leg crushed under a fragment of steel. Coenders removed his helmet and stared at the wreckage in silence. He had seen this too many times. "Record the data," he said quietly. "We try again tomorrow." He left the gallery without looking back. Heinz Smalenbach followed him through the tunnels. "August," he said, catching up. "We can't keep doing this. The materials aren't stable. The charges overpressure the chamber." Coenders cut him off. "The math works. The theory is sound." "Yes," Smalenbach replied. "But the war isn't fought on paper." They passed a group of forced laborers carrying tools, their faces gray with chalk dust. One stumbled, and an SS guard struck him with a rifle butt. Coenders didn't react. He had learned not to see. His world was numbers, not men. Still, that night he couldn't sleep. He lay in the bunk room reserved for officers, the low rumble of generators seeping through the concrete. In his mind, he replayed the explosion frame by frame, the ignition sequence, the gas pressure curve, the timing delay. He saw again the young technician's face in the flash of the blast, his body thrown backward. The calculations did not include screams. Outside, the winter wind keened through the narrow valleys of the Pas de Calais. On the surface, Mimoyekes looked peaceful. Farmhouses lit by candlelight, soldiers huddled in guard huts. But below, hundreds of men worked without pause, breathing the dust of the mountain, eating little more than soup and black bread. Every week, more died. The war had become an equation of bodies and time. In early 1944, the SS dispatched a new overseer, Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Kapp, a man whose reputation for efficiency bordered on sadism. He arrived wearing polished boots and a gray greatcoat, his eyes cold as the limestone around him. His first inspection lasted 6 hours. When it ended, he summoned Koenders to his office. "The Führer expects results before summer," Kapp said, lighting a cigarette. "Operation Overlord will not wait for your mathematics." Koenders stood rigid. "Herr Oberstleutnant, we require more testing. The synchronization system." Kapp interrupted. "You require discipline. You engineers live in your theories. The war lives in reality. London must burn before the Americans land in France." He exhaled smoke into Koenders' face. "Make it work, or I will find someone who can." When Koenders returned to his team, his hands were shaking. He didn't tell them what Kapp had said, but they understood. The pace intensified. Testing shifted to night hours. Barrels were reinforced with new steel alloys, and the timing circuits redesigned with relays stolen from Luftwaffe radar systems. The fortress became a laboratory of desperation. Meanwhile, in Germany, the skies themselves were turning against the Reich. Allied bombers flattened factories from Hamburg to Essen. Supply trains vanished under strafing runs. The shipments to Mimoyeke slowed, then stopped. Yet Kammler's office continued to send orders. Construction must proceed uninterrupted. The engineers began improvising. They melted down spare pipes for barrel linings. They scavenged copper from abandoned telephone lines. One of Smolenbach's assistants, a young metallurgist from Munich, discovered a way to temper steel using heated brine, reducing barrel erosion by a fraction. That small improvement saved weeks of testing, and perhaps their lives. In March 1944, Koenders tested the first full-scale combustion sequence using an inert projectile. The result astonished even him. The firing chamber held. The pressure curve matched predictions within 8%. When the data reached Berlin, the reply came within hours. "Proceed to live fire immediately." On April 2nd, the first operational shell was loaded into one of the partially completed barrels. The crew retreated to the control bunker, faces pale under the dim red lights. Koenders counted aloud, his voice trembling. 3, 2, 1, fire. The mountain itself seemed to inhale. Then came a thunderclap that rolled across the countryside. Dust poured from the ceiling. Instruments jumped from their mounts. Somewhere deep in the barrel, a sequence of charges ignited in flawless rhythm. Pop, 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 like a drum roll of war. When the firing stopped, silence returned, heavier than before. The shell had traveled 88 kilometers before plunging into the channel. It had worked. For the first time, Koenders allowed himself a smile. "It can reach England," he whispered. "It will reach London." But that night, as the engineers celebrated with watered wine, Smolenbach sat apart, staring into his glass. "We've built something that can change the world," he said. Koenders nodded, not understanding the tone. Smolenbach looked up. "Yes, but the world it changes may not be worth living in." Outside, the sea wind howled through the tunnels, carrying with it a distant echo, the sound of bombers crossing the channel. The Allies had seen Mimoyekes from the sky, and soon they would come to bury it. Moscow, February 1944. The snow fell thick and silent over the red brick walls of the Kremlin, muting the sound of trucks grinding across the frozen cobblestones. Inside the gray building of the main artillery directorate, a group of officers and engineers sat in a smoke-filled conference room, studying grainy aerial photographs spread across the table. The images had come from London, British reconnaissance flights over northern France, and they showed something extraordinary, a construction site unlike any known German fortification. At first glance, it looked like a mining complex, shafts, rail spurs, ventilation towers. But the analysis told a different story. "The tunnels are angled at 50 degrees, said Colonel Boris Orlov, chief of the Directorate's Technical Intelligence Division. "Each one points directly toward the English Channel. That's no mine. It's a gun emplacement, a big one." Across the table sat General Andrei Blagonravov, one of the Red Army's foremost artillery experts, his uniform immaculate, his expression unreadable. "How big?" Orlov hesitated. "If our British comrades are correct, enormous. They call it the V3, a gun capable of firing a shell across the channel, 150 kilometers. The room went still. "Across the channel," Blagonravov repeated slowly. "That's not artillery. That's a new kind of warfare." He leaned back, exhaling cigarette smoke toward the ceiling. And you think it's real? We don't know, Comrade General, said Orlov. But we've heard similar reports from our agents in France. The Germans call it Hochdruckpumpe, the high-pressure pump. They say it uses a series of auxiliary charges to accelerate the projectile. The concept appears to be legitimate. The British think it could hit London. Blagorovov's eyes narrowed. If they can reach London, they can reach Moscow. He turned to his aide. Send copies of these photographs to NII-1 and NII-88 immediately. I want theoretical assessments within 2 weeks. And tell them, he paused, tapping his finger on the photo of Mimo Yekis, to think not like gunners, but like engineers. If the fascists are building such a weapon, we will understand it, and we will build one of our own. The Soviet Union in 1944 was a land of paradox, a nation simultaneously in ruins and at the peak of its industrial power. From Leningrad to Magnitogorsk, factories operated day and night, turning iron, oil, and human exhaustion into tanks and shells. Yet deep in the research institutes scattered across Moscow and the Urals, another war was being fought. The war of ideas, of equations, of steel dreams. At the Artillery Scientific Research Institute No. 1, NII-1, a small team led by engineer Georgy Durakin began studying the German concept. The idea of sequential charge acceleration was not new. Russian engineers had toyed with it as early as the 1930s, but the practical difficulties, timing, pressure control, barrel wear, had rendered it a curiosity. Now, with intelligence from the West, it became an urgent priority. Durakin was a compact man with restless eyes and a mind that raced ahead of his words. His office walls were covered in chalk equations, ballistic diagrams, and fragments of metal from German shells captured at the front. He worked 12-hour days, sustained by black tea and cigarettes, chasing the impossible. It's brilliant, in theory, he told his colleague, physicist Mikhail Leskov, as they bent over a drawing board. Each chamber ignites in sequence as the projectile passes, constantly increasing acceleration. If the Germans can make it work, they could double the range of any artillery piece. Leskov frowned. And burn out every barrel after 3 shots. Durakin smiled thinly. That's the problem with theory. The steel must be perfect. The charges must fire in microsecond harmony. It's not just engineering, it's choreography. He paused, then added, Still, I want to see if it can be done. For science, if not for war. But war was the only science Stalin truly valued. When Blagorovov received Durakin's preliminary report, he brought it directly to Marshal of Artillery Voronov, who read it in silence before setting it down. If it works, Voronov said finally, such a gun could reach Berlin from Smolensk, or Königsberg from Minsk. But that's a dangerous way to think. Blagorovov nodded. The danger lies in not thinking it. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence on the ground confirmed the British suspicions. Partisan reports from the Pas de Calais described tunnels filled with steel barrels and slave laborers working under the SS. In April 1944, a coded dispatch from the French resistance reached Moscow via Stockholm. German supergun nearing completion. Intended target, London. The Kremlin responded with a mixture of fascination and alarm. Stalin ordered a full technical dossier prepared for the State Defense Committee. The report, bound in red leather, concluded with a single line. Feasibility uncertain, destructive potential immense. Still, Stalin's engineers could not resist the challenge. At the Central Artillery Design Bureau, a secret project codenamed Zaryad began under Durakin's direction. They built a scaled-down model, an experimental barrel just 12 meters long, fitted with small auxiliary chambers along its sides. In July, they conducted their first test at the proving ground outside Gorky. The result mirrored the Germans' own early failures. The first charge fired correctly. The second ignited too soon, tearing the projectile apart mid-barrel. The gun split open like a peeled fruit, scattering fragments across the snow. Durakin barely escaped with his life. 2 technicians were killed. When the smoke cleared, Durakin knelt beside the wreckage, his face streaked with soot. So, he said bitterly, the laws of physics are the same for everyone. He wrote to Blagorovov that evening. The concept is real, but the material strength required exceeds our capabilities. We cannot synchronize the charges without electronic control beyond current technology. For now, it remains a dream. His report was classified and filed away in the vaults of NII-88. But the idea did not die. In the margins of his final draft, Durakin scribbled a thought that would resurface years later, during the dawn of the space age. Perhaps not a cannon for war, but for the stars. Back in France, unaware that their Soviet counterparts were chasing the same vision. Coenders and Smolenbach continued to dig deeper into the hill, unaware that eyes from both London and Moscow were now upon them. The race to control the future of range had begun. May 1944. The tunnels of Mimoyekes were now a kingdom of shadows. Dust clung to every surface, the air thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and limestone. The fortress was nearly complete. 5 inclined barrels, each 130 meters long, embedded deep in the hill. The SS officers called it England Kanone, the England gun, but among the engineers, it was known simply as Das Tier, the beast. Every day, the beast demanded sacrifices. August Coender stood before the firing chamber of Barrel 3, his face lit by the pale glow of an inspection lamp. The steel tubing stretched upward at a terrifying angle, disappearing into the mountain's heart. Along its length ran the side chambers, 40 in total, each one fitted with a small explosive charge and electrical ignition cable. They looked like ribs on a colossal skeleton. The sequence must be perfect, he said, half to himself. One failure, and the entire structure dies. He traced the diagram with his finger. The projectile fired by the main charge, each auxiliary explosion timed to strike the shell as it passed, adding velocity like a hammer striking an anvil. The final muzzle speed, if everything worked, would reach nearly 1,500 meters per second, enough to send a 2-meter-long shell over the channel and into the heart of London in less than 2 minutes. The theory was elegant, the reality monstrous. Each test revealed new problems. The timing relays burned out under the strain. The charges misfired, detonating prematurely and splitting barrels open. The shells warped from frictional heat. The engineers worked in fear and exhaustion, knowing that failure meant not just a broken gun, but execution. SS Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Kapp, Kammler's deputy, visited the site daily. He carried a riding crop, which he tapped idly against his boot as he spoke to the engineers. "The Führer expects this weapon operational before August," he said one morning, standing over Coender's drafting table. "You will deliver it, or you will not live to see September." Coenders bowed slightly, saying nothing. He had stopped arguing long ago. The following week, the first full pressure test was scheduled. For days, crews reinforced the firing gallery with new concrete supports. Auxiliary power cables were tested, fuses calibrated, and blast doors sealed. On the morning of May 12th, the tunnels buzzed with controlled panic. At 0900 hours, the test began. Coenders watched from the control bunker, sweat glistening on his forehead, despite the cold. His hand trembled over the ignition switch. Smolenbach stood beside him, stopwatch ready. "Pressure at maximum," the technician reported. "All circuits armed. Fire." The first charge detonated with a deep, throaty roar. Then came the second, the third, the fourth. A rolling thunder building into something inhuman. The ground shook. Dust rained from the ceiling. Each auxiliary charge ignited in sequence, sending ripples of power through the barrel. For 37 milliseconds, the weapon worked exactly as designed. Then came the failure. Charge 22 ignited too early. The resulting shockwave slammed into the projectile, shattering it mid-barrel. The remaining charges fired into chaos. The explosion that followed tore through the upper gallery like a hurricane of flame and shrapnel. The lights went out. Screams filled the darkness. When the dust cleared, Barrel 3 was gone, collapsed inward like a crushed pipe. 14 men were dead, 6 missing. The air reeked of burned metal and blood. Coender stood in silence, staring at the wreckage. His mind calculated automatically. Timing error, 3 microseconds. Pressure differential, 62 atmospheres. Chamber failure probability, 84%. But no equation could explain the sound of dying men echoing through the tunnels. Kapp arrived an hour later. His face was expressionless as he surveyed the bodies lined against the wall under canvas sheets. "You will fix it," he said. Coenders nodded, though inside something was breaking. That night, he sat alone in his quarters, staring at a small photograph of his wife and son back in Kassel. He had not seen them in 2 years. He wondered if they would ever know what he was doing here, buried in a mountain, building a weapon designed to erase a city. He poured himself a glass of schnapps from the officer's ration. The liquid burned his throat. Smolenbach entered quietly. "August," he said, closing the door. "They're sending new laborers tomorrow. Kammler insists we continue immediately." Coenders didn't look up. "Of course he does." Smolenbach hesitated. "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time to stop." Coenders gave a bitter laugh. "And tell whom? The SS? The Führer? This project has a gravity of its own. No one escapes it." Smolenbach lowered his voice. Maybe we could delay. Pretend it isn't ready. Save time until the Allies. The word Allies hung in the air like a gunshot. Coenders looked at him sharply. Be careful, Heinz. Words can kill faster than artillery. Smallenbach nodded, but his eyes didn't waver. Then, let them kill me. I'd rather die for something human than build a monster for men who've forgotten what that means. For the first time in months, Coenders couldn't answer. He stared at the flickering lamp, the shadows dancing on the walls like ghosts. The equations that had once filled his dreams now looked like epitaphs. Every improvement, every calculation, was another step toward perfecting death. Outside, the rumble of distant thunder rolled across the channel, or perhaps it was the sound of bombers. The Allies had begun their nightly raids over northern France, and though the Luftwaffe fired back desperately, the sky belonged to the enemy now. In London, thousands of people slept unaware that a mountain across the sea was being hollowed out to destroy them. In Mimo Yekis, hundreds of prisoners labored underground, never seeing daylight, building the weapon meant to end them all. The mathematics of death was precise, efficient, and unstoppable. But it was not infallible, and soon, the heavens themselves would strike back. June 1944. RAF Medmenham, Buckinghamshire, England. In a quiet country estate ringed by oak trees and sandbagged windows, Britain's most secret war was fought not with bombs or bullets, but with magnifying glasses. Inside the photo interpretation unit, under the pale light of drafting lamps, rows of men and women bent over stereoscopes, turning grainy aerial photographs into intelligence that could shape the fate of nations. On a humid afternoon, Flight Officer Constance Babington Smith adjusted the lenses of her viewer and peered at a new set of reconnaissance prints just arrived from the PRU Spitfire squadrons flying out of Mount Farm. The photographs showed the French coast, Pas de Calais, near the town of Marquise. The landscape seemed ordinary at first, rolling farmland, clusters of cottages, faint scars of bomb craters. But something caught her eye. In one frame, a series of parallel lines etched the hillside, 5 dark grooves converging toward a single direction. They were not roads, nor trenches. They were too regular, too symmetrical, and at the mouth of each, faint scaffolding, machinery, and rail tracks vanished into the chalk cliffs. Babington Smith frowned. She reached for the previous reconnaissance series and overlaid the images. The lines hadn't existed 2 months earlier. Sergeant, she called across the room. Bring me the earlier run over Mimoyekes. April, I think. The sergeant returned moments later with a stack of prints. Babington Smith compared them, then turned to the officer on duty, a grizzled veteran named Wing Commander Norman. Sir, I think we found another V site. Norman walked over, squinting at the photos. Looks like quarries to me. Not quite, she said, her finger tracing the incline. Look at the angle. About 50 degrees, all pointing toward the same bearing. If I extend the lines on the map. She took a pencil and ruler, connecting the grooves to their projected trajectory. The lines crossed the channel and met directly over London. Norman's cigarette froze halfway to his mouth. Good Lord, he murmured. They're building a gun. Within 24 hours, the photographs were flown to Whitehall. The Joint Intelligence Committee convened an emergency session, attended by Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory, Lord Cherwell, and representatives from MI6. The evidence was clear. The Germans were constructing something massive under the Pas de Calais, bigger than the V-1 launch ramps, deeper than any bomb shelter yet found. The briefing began with a single sentence. Gentlemen, the enemy may soon possess a cannon capable of firing into London from France. Lee Mallory leaned forward. Do we have range estimates? Preliminary calculations, replied Group Captain Bannister. Suggest up to 160 kilometers. The code name the Germans use is V3. The V stands for Vergeltung, vengeance. Lord Cherwell exhaled through his teeth. So, they intend to pound us without ever taking off. The site at Mimoyekes is nearly complete, Bannister continued. Our analysts believe each barrel could deliver 1 shell every few seconds. If operational, the bombardment could level London's industrial districts in days. The room fell silent. The shadow of the Blitz still haunted every man present. Then Lee Mallory spoke. Then we'll bury it before it fires. The order reached RAF Bomber Command the same evening. Operation Crossbow, the campaign against Germany's secret weapons, would now target Mimoyekes as priority 1. The first attack was scheduled for July. At RAF Coningsby, squadron leader Leonard Cheshire studied the reconnaissance photographs pinned to the operations board. The site looked unassuming, barely visible beneath its camouflage nets, but the intelligence brief described it as potentially the greatest single threat to the Allied invasion. Cheshire, one of the RAF's most decorated pilots, had seen everything from Hamburg's firestorms to Dam's raid craters. Yet even he felt uneasy. "A gun that can hit London from France," he muttered. "God help us if they finish it." Across the channel, at Mimoyek itself, the Germans worked frantically. Allied bombing had already forced delays in the V-1 and V-2 programs, and Kammler now demanded the V-3 be completed at all costs. Prisoners labored through the night, digging deeper, reinforcing the galleries with steel ribs. Coenders no longer spoke during inspections. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. He had become a machine serving a machine. In the control bunker, Smallenbach studied a set of blueprints illuminated by a single lamp. "August," he said quietly. "The British must know by now. We can't hide a fortress under a hill forever." Coenders didn't look up. "Let them come. Maybe they'll put us out of our misery." Above them, unseen in the darkening sky, a silver Spitfire from number 541 Squadron sliced through the clouds at 30,000 feet, its camera lens capturing every inch of the site below. Within days, the RAF would know exactly where to strike. July 6, 1944. The morning broke with a strange stillness over northern France. The prisoners noticed it first, the distant drone that grew louder by the minute. Then the siren screamed. At 09:30, the first wave of Lancaster bombers crossed the coast. Each carried a new weapon designed by Barnes-Wallis, the 12,000-pound tall boy, a deep penetration bomb capable of smashing through solid rock. Inside the tunnels, Coenders and his team heard the earth begin to tremble. "Get to the shelters," someone shouted, but it was too late. The first detonation struck near the main entrance, collapsing the upper galleries in a roar of pulverized stone. The shockwave rolled through the tunnels like a living thing. Smallenbach was thrown to the ground as lights flickered and died. Dust choked the air. Men screamed in the dark. Above ground, the sky was fire. The tall boys fell one after another, each creating craters large enough to swallow houses. The chalk hills convulsed as if alive, fountains of dust erupting hundreds of meters high. When the final bomber banked away, Mimoyekes was no longer a fortress. It was a tomb. Hours later, Coenders clawed his way out through a breach near the auxiliary tunnel, blood running down his face. Around him lay the ruins of his creation. Collapsed galleries, twisted steel, crushed bodies. The weapon that was to destroy London had been buried under its own ambition. He stared at the smoking craters, the horizon glowing red from the setting sun. Somewhere across that sea, the lights of London were still burning. He whispered to no one, "You were lucky this time." And behind him, the mountain groaned as another section of tunnel collapsed, sealing the dream of the V-3 beneath thousands of tons of earth. July 7th, 1944. Dawn broke over the French coast with a heavy mist that rolled through the valleys of Pas-de-Calais like smoke from an unseen fire. The ruins of Mimoyekes steamed in the morning light, the ground cracked open by craters deep enough to swallow locomotives. The fortress that had once been the pride of Hitler's engineers now lay in shattered silence. Only the crows, circling over the chalk cliffs, dared to speak. 2 kilometers away, in a forward RAF observation post near the village of Boulogne, Squadron Leader John Searby adjusted his binoculars. His orders were simple: confirm destruction. The night before, 16 Lancasters from number 617 Squadron, the Dam Busters, had unleashed their new weapon, the Tallboy bomb, on the fortress at Mimoyekes. Each bomb weighed 6 tons and fell at nearly the speed of sound. From the air, it had looked like the end of the world.